I arrived in the United States in 2004, a fresh face with big dreams, full of hope. I had always imagined a life of possibility in America, a life where Michael and I could build a family, create something of our own. The way he spoke about his small town made it sound so peaceful, the perfect place to raise children, to grow old together. But what I didn't expect, what no one could have warned me about, was how much I would change when I crossed that border. I had met Michael while working at a resort in Cancun. He had been on holiday, a young mechanic looking for a break from his noisy life back home. We spent a week together. He was kind. More than that, he was patient. I was so accustomed to the fast pace of the city, the push and pull of people coming and going, that I forgot how to just be with someone. Michael taught me that. He would take me on walks on the beach at sunset, letting the cool breeze swirl around us as we talked about everything and nothing. There was a gentleness about him that made me believe we could have something special. And when he proposed, my heart was full. I was ready to leave behind the life I had known, to step into a new world. America seemed like a promise. But the reality of life in his small town hit me hard, far harder than I ever expected. The first thing I noticed was how different everything felt. The people here weren't like the ones in Cancun. They weren't as warm. Michael's family, his mother especially, had a coolness to her that I didn't know how to handle. She was polite, but there was something behind her eyes that made me feel like I was an outsider. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just nerves. But then I noticed the glances, the subtle, almost imperceptible ways people would stiffen when I walked into a room. It wasn't just his family. It was everyone. When we went out to the local supermarket, it was clear that I stood out. I could hear the murmurs, the faint whispers between aisles. People didn't always mean to be rude, but it was there, the way they would talk to Michael but look at me like I didn't belong. One afternoon, I was standing at the checkout line when the woman in front of me, a regular customer, I could tell from the way the cashier greeted her, turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're the one who's married to Michael, right?" she asked, her voice sweet but flat. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. She continued, "I always wondered why he'd pick someone like you." She smiled again, that same empty smile, before turning back to her groceries. It hit me like a slap, but I stood there, my chest tight, and let it go. I wasn't sure how to react, or if I even should. Michael, who had been walking just a few steps ahead of me, turned around at that moment, and the woman quickly looked down at her cart as if she had never said a word. But I heard it and it stayed with me. The racism wasn't always so overt. Sometimes, it was just the silence, the way people wouldn't acknowledge me at all. Michael's co-workers, who were friendly enough to him, would barely speak to me. And when they did, it was like they were speaking down to me, as if I were a child who couldn't understand their language. The worst part was that Michael didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, but he didn't know what to do about it. One evening, a few months after I had arrived, we were at a party at Michael's cousin Derek's house. I was hoping to make friends, to get to know people, to feel a part of their world. Michael introduced me to a few people, and they were polite, but distant. Derek, who was a few years older than Michael, was the exception. He'd been to Cancun a couple of times, and he was excited to talk to me about it. "So, you're from Mexico, huh?" Derek asked, taking a swig of beer. His eyes were too bright, too eager. I could tell he had been drinking, but I wanted to stay open. Maybe he was just excited. "Yes," I said with a smile, "I'm from a town outside of Mexico City." "That's cool," he said, grinning. "Must be nice, huh? To have a beach and all those tourists. I bet you made good money from all the gringos?" I paused, not sure how to respond. "It wasn't like that," I said carefully. "I worked hard. It wasn't easy." But Derek wasn't listening. "I bet it's just like those places in the movies, huh? Pretty women in bikinis, drinks on the beach. I'm sure you met all kinds of rich men. Or maybe, one of those drug lords." The joke landed with an uncomfortable thud. I felt my face flush, the blood rushing to my cheeks as I tried to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, forcing a smile, but it felt thin, like it was going to crack at any moment. He laughed. "Hey, I'm just messing with you. Mexico is crazy. You ever been caught up in any of that? The cartels?" I hear it's dangerous down there. My hands clenched into fists. I could feel the heat of anger rising in my chest, but I tried to hold it back. Michael was nearby, talking to some friends, and I didn't want to cause a scene. I took a deep breath, told myself to let it go. But it hurt. It hurt that Michael wasn't stepping in, that he was letting it happen. By the time we left the party that night, I was quiet, staring out of the window of the car, trying to keep my emotions in check. Michael noticed, of course. He asked if I was okay, but I couldn't tell him what was wrong. What could I say? I didn't know if he would understand. At home, I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Derek's voice. I heard the laughter of people who didn't see me as human, only as something foreign, something to be mocked or pitied. I wasn't from here. I wasn't like them. No matter how hard I tried to fit in, there was always a wall between us, a wall that was impossible to climb. I spent my days in silence, wondering if I had made a mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. I had promised Michael I would be with him, that we would build a life together. But the weight of this alienation, this feeling of being suffocated by the world around me, made it feel like I was sinking into quicksand. One day, I was walking down Main Street, trying to gather my thoughts, when a car pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and a young man I didn't recognize leaned out. "Hey," he called, grinning. "I know you're the new wife. You married to that mechanic, right?" I nodded, trying to ignore the irritation rising inside me. "Man, that guy's lucky," he said, his voice casual. "He's got himself a hot little Mexican woman. You know, you'd make a lot of money working the clubs around here. Ever thought about that?" I stopped walking, the words ringing in my ears. I knew what he was implying, and I hated it. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him to go to hell, but instead, I just turned and kept walking. I didn't say anything, but I knew that from that moment, things would never be the same. I couldn't keep pretending it didn't matter. It mattered. It always would. It had been almost a year since I moved to the United States, and things had not gotten any easier. The loneliness, the isolation, the constant feeling that I didn't belong, it was wearing me down. Michael, despite his kindness, had no idea what I was going through. He tried to be supportive, but it felt like we were living in two different worlds. I was still the foreigner in his town, the one who didn't fit in, the one who would always be on the outside looking in. That's when Raul arrived. Raul was my cousin, but he felt more like a brother. We had grown up together in Mexico, spent endless afternoons running around the neighborhood, getting into trouble, laughing about things that no one else would understand. We were close, really close. When I heard he was moving to the States, I was relieved. I needed someone here, someone who understood me in a way that no one else could. Raul had always been the adventurous one, the one who wasn't afraid to take risks. He had left Mexico a few months before me, and he had settled in a city not too far from where Michael and I were living. The first time I saw him after he arrived, I was overwhelmed with emotion. It was like a piece of home had landed in this foreign land. We hugged tightly in the parking lot outside a small cafe, laughing like we hadn't seen each other in years. "You look different," I said, stepping back to take him in. Raul had changed. There was something about him, something more mature, more world-weary. But his smile was the same, and it made me feel a little lighter. He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, life here will do that to you. But you look like you've been through a lot. How are you doing, Sophia?" The question seemed so simple, but it hit me hard. How was I doing? How was anyone supposed to be doing when everything felt wrong? I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I'm surviving," I said finally, giving him a half-smile. "But it's hard, Raul. It's not what I thought it would be. I thought I'd come here and everything would be easy, that Michael and I would make a life together. But it's not that simple." Raul nodded, his eyes darkening with understanding. "I know. I've been there stuff. And the hardest part is feeling like you don't belong. Like you're invisible to everyone around you. But I'm here now, Sophia. We'll figure it out together." And that was the beginning of something I never expected. Raul became my anchor. Every week, without fail, we would meet up, sometimes for lunch, sometimes just to walk around town or grab a coffee. We would talk about everything: The difficulty of adjusting to life here, the frustrations of trying to fit into a place that didn't want us, the small victories that nobody else seemed to notice. But most of all, we would talk about family. We would reminisce about the old days in Mexico, about our parents and our cousins, about the sounds and smells of home that we both missed so much. Raul had his own struggles. He worked 2 jobs, one as a dishwasher at a local restaurant and another as a cleaner in an office building. He was constantly tired, his face lined with exhaustion, but he never complained. Not once. He was always looking out for me, always making sure I was okay. He knew what it was like to feel isolated, to be far away from family and everything familiar. But it wasn't just the hard times that brought us closer. There were the small moments of joy that we shared, too. One afternoon, we found an old Mexican food stand in the corner of a strip mall. It wasn't much, a tiny cart with a few folding tables, but the food smelled like it came straight from home. We ordered tacos al pastor and sat at one of the tables, laughing like we were back in Mexico, like we hadn't left. Raul told me stories about his job, about the strange things he had seen in this new country, and I told him about Michael and the people in town who still treated me like an outsider. We talked for hours, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt a little bit at peace. In the months that followed, our bond deepened. Raul didn't just listen to me, he understood me in a way that no one else could. He knew the ache of longing for home, the pain of being away from your roots. He knew the exhaustion of trying to fit into a place that wasn't ready to accept you. And he knew that sometimes, you had to build your own family, piece by piece, when the one you had left behind was so far away. But what I didn't expect was how much our relationship would change, how much it would evolve. The lines between us began to blur, and I wasn't sure when it happened, but at some point, I stopped seeing Raul as just my cousin and started seeing him as something more. It started small, little things like the way he would touch my hand when we were talking, or the way he would stand a little too close to me when we were walking. I could feel it too, the tension that simmered between us. It wasn't something we talked about, at least not at first. We were family after all. But the more we spent time together, the more those feelings grew. Raul was no longer just my cousin who had come to this strange country to help me get by. He was someone I found myself turning to when I was overwhelmed, someone who made me feel seen, like I was more than just the outsider trying to survive. There was a night, one that I'll never forget, when we were sitting on the porch of his apartment, watching the sunset. Raul had his arm around my shoulders, and I was leaning into him, my head resting on his chest. We didn't say much. Sometimes, that silence was the most comforting thing. But as the sky darkened and the stars came out, Raul turned to me, his voice softer than usual. "Sophia," he said, his breath warm on my ear. "I don't want you to feel like you're alone here. You're not. I'm here. I'll always be here, no matter what." It was the way he said it, the tenderness in his voice, that made my heart race. I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't sure what to say. But in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't just feeling the ache of missing home anymore. I was feeling something new, something complicated. It was a feeling I wasn't ready to confront, not yet. But it was there, lingering, growing with each passing day. Raul and I spent more time together after that night. We would talk late into the night, and sometimes, we would sit in silence, just enjoying each other's company. It was strange, though, like we were walking on a thin line, one that could snap at any moment. I knew it wasn't right, not in the way I should have known. But it was happening. Slowly. Quietly. I wasn't sure what to do with it. I wasn't sure how to handle this new dynamic between us. But I knew one thing. Raul had become my lifeline. He was the only person in this foreign country who truly understood me, the only one who made me feel like I was worth something. In a place where I had always been invisible, Raul made me feel seen. And in a way, that was more than I had ever hoped for. But the line between us was becoming blurred, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend it didn't matter. I never expected it to happen. I never thought that the relationship between me and Raul would turn into something more, but it did. It happened slowly, quietly, like the creeping tide of the ocean. Not something I could have predicted, but once it was there, it was impossible to ignore. Michael had been working long hours at the shop. He'd been picking up extra shifts lately, trying to save money for things we needed. I told myself that it was just temporary, that it was his way of providing for us. But the hours he worked turned into days, and the days turned into weeks, and we barely saw each other anymore. He would leave before the sun came up and get home after dark, exhausted and distant. And when he was home, he wasn't really there. His mind was elsewhere, on the job, on his next shift. I told myself that I should be grateful. After all, this was what we needed, wasn't it? But I couldn't help the emptiness that began to grow inside of me. Michael's absence wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. He didn't seem to notice the distance between us, didn't realize how lonely I was in this unfamiliar place. I was here, in a country that didn't feel like home, with a life that felt incomplete, and no one seemed to understand. No one except Raul. Raul had always been there for me. From the moment he arrived in the United States, he became my lifeline. We shared everything, our struggles, our frustrations, our longing for home. He was the one person who made me feel like I wasn't alone in this. And over time, I began to rely on him more and more. He knew exactly how to make me feel seen, to make me feel important. His attention, his kindness, was like a balm for the hurt I carried. And it wasn't just about the big gestures, it was in the little things. The way he remembered the small details about me, the way he asked how I was really doing, the way he would just listen when I needed to talk. It was something I hadn't realized I was craving, but once I had it, it was like I couldn't live without it. One night, Michael was late coming home again. I'd spent the evening alone in our small apartment, the silence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I picked up my phone and sent a text to Raul, asking if he was free to meet. He replied almost immediately, suggesting we grab some coffee. I agreed, and within an hour, we were sitting at a small cafe in the corner of town, talking like we always did. But tonight felt different. The air between us seemed charged, like there was something unspoken hanging over us. We sat at a corner table, both of us sipping our drinks in silence for a while. Raul's eyes never left me, and for the first time, I couldn't look away. There was a depth in his gaze that I hadn't noticed before. Maybe I had noticed it, but I hadn't been ready to face it. Now it was all I could see. "Sophia," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "You've been so distant lately. I can see it. I know it's hard, but I hate seeing you like this." I wanted to say that I was fine, that everything would be okay. But I couldn't. I wasn't fine. I was far from it. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, I just shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. It was the first time I had let myself cry in front of him, and it felt like a release, like all the tension I had been holding in was finally being let go. Raul reached across the table, his hand resting gently on mine. "You don't have to hide from me, Sophia," he said softly. "You don't have to pretend that you're okay. You don't have to do it alone. I'm here for you, always." His words, the way he looked at me, it was like something inside me finally broke. The weight of the loneliness, the weight of everything I had been holding in, seemed too much to bear. I pulled my hand away, standing up quickly, my heart racing. Raul stood too, his expression full of concern. "Wait," he said, his voice firm now. He stepped toward me, taking a step closer and then another. I backed up, not because I didn't want him near me, but because I didn't know how to stop what was happening. I didn't know how to pull myself back. My breath caught in my throat as he came even closer. And then, without thinking, he reached out and cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that I hadn't even realized were falling. "Raul," I started, but my voice faltered as I looked into his eyes. His gaze was intense, full of longing, full of something I didn't want to admit. My body was betraying me, my pulse hammering in my chest, and before I could stop it, I felt myself leaning toward him. He didn't pull away. Instead, he closed the distance between us, and when his lips touched mine, it felt like the world tilted beneath my feet. I froze at first, unsure, caught in a whirlwind of confusion. But Raul didn't pull back. He kissed me again, slowly, gently, as if he was waiting for me to make a decision. And in that moment, I made it. I kissed him back. Everything in me screamed that this was wrong, that I should stop, that I was married, that I had no right to do this. But in that moment, none of those thoughts could silence the need that burned inside me. The loneliness, the isolation, the yearning for someone to care, it all came rushing to the surface, and Raoul was the only one who had ever seen it. He was the only one who had ever truly looked at me and cared. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and I let him. I let him in a way I had never let anyone in before. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. It was the touch I had been craving, the tenderness I hadn't known I needed, and in that moment, it felt like nothing else mattered. We didn't speak for a long time. We didn't need to. The world outside that cafe ceased to exist as we stood there, tangled in each other's arms, wrapped in a moment that felt like it could never end. But eventually, the reality of what had just happened hit me, and a cold rush of guilt swept through me. I pulled away from him, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding. "Oh, we can't. I'm married," I whispered, my voice shaky. "This isn't right." He held my gaze, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said quietly. "I know, Sophia. But that doesn't change what's happening between us. You're not alone here. Not anymore." I didn't know what to say to that. The words felt too heavy, too full of things I wasn't ready to face. Instead, I took a step back, my hands trembling. "I'm sorry," I muttered, unable to look him in the eye. I turned and fled the cafe, the weight of my actions sinking into the pit of my stomach. As I walked through the dark streets, my thoughts were a whirlwind. What had I done? What was I doing? But no matter how hard I tried to push it away, the truth was undeniable. In Raoul's arms, I had found something I hadn't even known I was searching for. It was January 2012 when everything came crashing down. I can still remember that night, the one that changed everything, in vivid detail. How the air felt so cold, how the silence between me and Michael had stretched for days, weeks, like we were both living in parallel worlds and no one was brave enough to speak the truth. Raoul and I had been seeing each other in secret for months by then. The guilt of what we were doing gnawed at me every single day, but Raoul was the one person who truly understood me. He had been my rock, the one person who always made me feel like I wasn't invisible. Even when I tried to push him away, he came back. And when I told myself over and over that I would stop, that I had to stop, I never could. I couldn't stop seeing him, couldn't stop leaning on him when Michael was absent. Michael had no idea. At least, that's what I told myself. I convinced myself that I was good at hiding it, that the cracks in my marriage were something I could patch up before anyone saw. But I should have known better. Michael wasn't stupid. He saw the way I looked at Raoul, the way my mood would lift when I was around him. He knew there was something more, even if he never voiced it. I think deep down he had suspected. That night, January 2012, everything finally came to a head. Michael had been working late again, like he always did, and Raoul and I had been talking on the phone. We'd been planning to meet later, but I knew it wasn't a good idea. Something inside me felt like it was all about to unravel, like this secret couldn't stay buried much longer. I thought I'd be able to wait until Michael came home, but then I heard the front door slam open. Michael was home early. I froze. My heart stopped for a beat. I didn't know what to do. Should I hide? Should I pretend that everything was fine? But it was too late for that. Michael walked into the living room, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. His face was flushed with anger, his eyes sharp with suspicion. "Who were you talking to?" he asked, his voice low but edged with something I couldn't quite place. I didn't answer right away. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to say. The truth was impossible. How could I possibly explain this to him? I couldn't. There were no words for what had happened, for the mess I had made of everything. "Michael, I began, but he didn't let me finish. Don't lie to me, Sophia," he snapped, his voice rising. I know you've been seeing him. I know about you and Ra." I felt my stomach drop. The shock hit me like a punch. He knew. How much did he know? How long had he known? His words tumbled out in a furious rush, and I could see that something inside him had snapped. His eyes were wild, like a man on the edge of losing control. "I don't know what you think you're doing," he said, his voice shaking with anger, "but this ends tonight. You think you can just throw everything away, huh? You think you can, Before he could finish, the front door opened again. Raoul had arrived, just as we had planned. He walked in, unaware of the storm that was already brewing in the room. He looked at me first, his eyes softening when he saw my expression. But when his gaze shifted to Michael, his face hardened, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. He knew something was wrong. "Michael," Raoul said, his voice calm but firm, "let's talk about this. There's no need for violence." Michael's face twisted with fury. "Violence?" he spat. "You think I'm going to just let you waltz in here like you own everything? You think you can just take what's mine?" Raoul stepped forward, his posture tense but not aggressive, trying to keep things calm, trying to keep the situation from escalating. But Michael was beyond reasoning. He wasn't listening. His anger was overwhelming, and there was a manic energy in the air that I couldn't escape. "Michael, please," I begged, my voice breaking. "Stop. This isn't the way to handle it. Please." But Michael wasn't listening to me. His gaze was fixed on Raoul, and I saw his hand twitch, like he was looking for something. I didn't know where it came from, whether it was a gun or something else, but in a blur of motion, Michael pulled it from his waistband. Time seemed to slow. My mind screamed at me, but my body couldn't move. I saw the way Michael's hands shook, the way his finger tightened around the trigger. "Michael, no!" I cried, rushing toward him, but it was too late. A loud crack split the air. I froze in horror. I heard Raoul's gasping breath, saw his eyes widen in shock. Then, as if everything had shattered, he collapsed to the floor in a heap, blood spreading beneath him. I could hear the ringing in my ears, the sharp sound of my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Raoul was lying there, unmoving, blood pooling around him. "No, no, no, no!" I screamed, falling to my knees beside him, my hands shaking as I tried to stop the bleeding. But there was nothing I could do. His chest barely rose with each shallow breath, and his eyes were wide and unfocused. Michael stood there, frozen, the gun still clutched in his hand. I turned to him, my hands trembling, my heart racing in disbelief. "You didn't mean this. You didn't mean this," I whispered, but I knew. I knew he had. I knew something inside him had broken too, and now we were both living the consequences. Raoul's breathing became more erratic, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I tried to hold him, tried to call for help, but everything felt like it was happening too fast, like I was drowning in a nightmare I couldn't escape. "Michael, what did you do?" I screamed. "What did you do?" But he didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at Raoul's motionless body. And that's when I realized that everything I thought I knew about Michael, the man I had married, the man I had tried to love, was a lie. This wasn't the man I thought he was. This wasn't the man I'd built a life with. The sirens came soon after, but by the time help arrived, Raoul was gone. And so was everything I had ever known. I didn't know how to process it. How could I? I had lost him. My cousin, my support, the only person who had ever truly been there for me in this strange country, and I had lost him because of a stupid, senseless argument, because of a mistake Michael made in a moment of rage. And I had lost myself too, in a way. The person I had been before all of this, the woman who was in love with a man she trusted, the woman who had felt like she had a future, was gone. Raoul was dead. Michael had killed him. There were no words for the grief I felt in those first few days. No words to express the rage, the confusion, the crushing sense of loss. My world had been turned upside down, and I didn't know how to find my way back. The night of February 8, 2012, was the culmination of everything that had been building inside of me. The grief, the anger, the despair. I had spent weeks, months even, consumed by the loss of Raoul, consumed by what Michael had done, by the way he had destroyed everything that had ever meant anything to me. It wasn't just about Raoul's death anymore. It was about the years of betrayal, the years of isolation, of living in a house that had never felt like home, with a man who had never truly seen me. I had put up with so much. I had tried so hard to hold everything together, but the weight of it all had finally broken me. Michael came home that evening, just like he always did, tired, distant, lost in his own world. He didn't even notice me. I could see him, there in the doorway, shrugging off his coat and heading toward the kitchen without a word. And for the first time in years, I realized something. I didn't care. I didn't care if he came home, I didn't care if he spoke to me, I didn't care about any of it. He had taken too much from me already. He had taken Raul. And in that moment, I decided that I would take everything from him. The thought didn't come as a flash of anger. It wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. It was something that had been building inside of me, festering in the shadows of my mind for months. It was the culmination of everything I had endured. His neglect, his cruelty, his inability to ever truly see me, to understand what I had gone through. It was the final act of a woman who had been broken, who had lost everything, and now, in the silence of that moment, I realized that the only thing left was revenge. I don't know when I made the decision, but by the time he was in the bedroom, I had already gotten the gun from the drawer where Michael kept it. He had always kept it close, like some sort of sick comfort for the life he had built, for the control he thought he had. It was a revolver, simple, heavy in my hands, cold and unforgiving. He was lying in bed, flipping through a magazine, the soft hum of the TV in the background. I walked into the room and closed the door behind me. He didn't even look up. "Michael," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He glanced up at me, his face blank, indifferent. "What is it, Sophia?" His tone was so casual, like we weren't standing at the edge of something that could end our lives. "I think you know," I replied, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it wasn't indifference. He frowned, sitting up on the bed now, eyes narrowing as if trying to make sense of what I was saying. "What the hell are you talking about?" And then I raised the gun. There was no hesitation. There was no doubt. All I could feel was a dark kind of clarity, a coldness that settled over me like ice. Michael didn't move at first. He looked at me as if he couldn't believe what was happening, as if he thought I would lower the gun, that this was just some twisted joke. "Sophia, what the hell are you?" I pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot was deafening, ringing in my ears. His body jerked, a flash of confusion crossing his face, and then he crumpled onto the bed, clutching his chest, gasping for air. Blood began to pool around him, staining the sheets. I stood there, frozen for a moment. The reality of what I had just done hit me like a punch to the gut. But then, something else washed over me. Relief. Relief that it was over. Relief that I had taken control for the first time in so long. Michael was still breathing, still alive, but he wouldn't be for long. He tried to speak, tried to move, but the words were lost in a violent cough as he gasped for breath. His eyes were wide with fear now, with the understanding that he had lost. "Why?" he managed to choke out, his voice weak and trembling. "Why, Sophia?" I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel anything except cold indifference. "For Raul," I whispered, my voice flat. "For everything you took from me." He tried to reach for me, but his hand fell short, his strength failing him. His gaze turned desperate, his breath becoming more shallow by the second. I watched him struggle. It felt like watching someone slowly fade away, but I didn't feel any mercy. I didn't feel any guilt. The years of his betrayal, of his coldness toward me, of everything he had done, came rushing back. The pain, the emptiness, the isolation, it all came crashing over me. This was the only thing I could do. The only thing left. I stood there watching him until finally he stopped moving. Then, the reality of the situation hit me fully. The door was still closed, the gun still in my hand, and Michael was dead. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know how to handle the aftermath. But one thing was certain, I had taken everything from him. I had avenged Raul. Minutes later, the phone rang. It was a reminder of everything that was about to come. I didn't answer. The sirens came not long after. I don't know how they found us so quickly. I don't know if Michael had somehow managed to call for help, or if it was the neighbors, or if someone else had tipped them off. But the next thing I knew, there were flashing lights outside, and the house was filled with the sound of approaching footsteps. I didn't run. I didn't try to hide. When the police arrived, I didn't deny what I had done. I didn't even try to make excuses. I was done hiding. I was done with the guilt that had eaten me alive for so long. When they asked me what happened, I looked at them, Detective Sarah Miles in charge of the case, and I told them everything. I killed him, I said simply, my voice devoid of any emotion. I killed him because of what he did. He killed Raul. And I couldn't let him get away with it. Detective Miles didn't say anything at first. She just watched me, her expression unreadable. But as she went through the house, as they looked around, they found it. The letters. The messages between me and Raul. They confirmed what everyone had suspected, what Michael had known, what I had tried so hard to deny. The affair. And as the truth came out, as I was led away in handcuffs, I felt something inside of me break. But it wasn't the kind of break that comes from regret. It was a break from the weight of everything that had been suffocating me for so long. I had avenged Raul. And in the process, I had set myself free. The trial was nothing like I had imagined. When I first found myself standing in that courtroom, facing the judge and the jury, I thought it would feel like a release, a way to tell my side of the story, to explain why everything had happened the way it did. But it didn't work that way. It wasn't cathartic. It wasn't liberating. It was just more of the same cold, indifferent eyes, the same judgment, the same silence. The days blurred together. The lawyer who had been assigned to me, a woman named Patricia, was decent enough, but she didn't know what I was feeling. She didn't know how deeply the weight of everything had crushed me. She didn't understand the years of isolation, the emotional violence, the constant ache of betrayal that had pushed me to that point. She tried to argue that my actions weren't premeditated, that they were the result of an emotional breakdown, a woman driven to madness by the loss of her cousin and the cruel treatment of a man who had betrayed her trust. Patricia argued that my life had been a pressure cooker, and one final, brutal event had set it all off. Michael's death had been an act of self-defense in my mind, an act of vengeance, yes, but also an attempt to reclaim control over my life after so many years of powerlessness. She painted a picture of a woman who had cracked under the weight of too much pain and too many years of neglect. But the prosecution wasn't having it. They didn't care about the emotional toll, the mental toll. They weren't interested in the years of suffering I had endured. All they saw was a calculated, deliberate act. A woman who had planned her husband's death with cold precision. They painted me as a ruthless killer who had methodically orchestrated Michael's demise. It didn't matter what I said. It didn't matter how much I tried to explain that I wasn't just a woman angry over an affair, that it wasn't just about Raul. It wasn't just about Michael. It was about everything. The years I had spent trying to hold together a life that was never mine to begin with, the loneliness, the guilt, the rage. They didn't want to hear any of it. They didn't care. The verdict came down in April 2014, nearly 2 years after the events that had changed everything. The judge's voice felt distant as he pronounced me guilty of second-degree murder. The words echoed in my mind, guilty, second-degree murder. It was like I was hearing them from somewhere far away, like I wasn't even there. 25 years in prison. A quarter of a century. I remember the courtroom feeling like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in as the shock set in. I didn't expect anything less. But still, hearing the judge confirm that I would spend the next 25 years of my life in prison, felt like the final nail in the coffin. Michael was gone. Raul was gone. And now, it was my turn to disappear into the system. The days after the verdict were a blur. There was no celebration, no sense of relief. I wasn't free. I wasn't vindicated. I was just another woman behind bars. There were no cheers, no voices of support from the people who might have understood. All that was left were whispers, judgment, and cold stares. The city was split in its assessment of the case. People on the streets, in the shops, at the local bars, they all had their opinions. Some called me a monster, a cold-blooded killer who had taken the life of a man who didn't deserve to die. They said I was cruel, that I had taken the law into my own hands, and that there was no excuse for what I had done. They said I had destroyed a family, Michael's family. But there were others, a smaller group, who sympathized with me. They understood the pressure I had been under, the emotional toll of living in a marriage where I was invisible, where I was nothing more than an object in his world. They knew the pain of being a foreigner in a country that had never truly accepted me, the pain of living with a man who never saw me for who I truly was. To them, my actions weren't just about revenge, they were an escape, a desperate cry for help from a woman who had been suffocated for too long. Michael's family was the loudest in their condemnation. His mother, especially, couldn't accept what I had done. She never saw me as anything more than an outsider, someone who had come from another country and destroyed everything they had built. To her, I was the villain in a story where Michael had done no wrong. In her eyes, the murder was proof of the danger of outsiders, of the people who came into their lives and wrecked everything. She spoke to the media, her words full of venom. She took my son's life, she said, her voice breaking with grief, but there was no sympathy for me, no understanding of what had driven me to this point. The town was divided. There were the people who saw me as a victim of circumstance, and then there were those who saw me as the enemy, the woman who had destroyed a family, who had taken the life of a man who, in their eyes, had done no wrong. The division was palpable, the bitterness in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. But none of it mattered anymore. I was behind bars. The voices, the opinions, they didn't change what had happened. They didn't change the fact that I had taken Michael's life in the most violent way I knew how. I had done it because I had been pushed to the brink, because I had nothing left to lose. And now I was paying the price. As I sat in that prison cell, I thought about all of it. Michael, Raul, the years of pain, the years of lies. And for the first time, I let myself feel it all. The guilt, the grief, the relief. But most of all, I let myself feel the emptiness. Because even after all that had happened, I was still just a woman trying to make sense of a life that had never truly been mine. Prison became my world, a new kind of silence that was heavier than any loneliness I had ever known. The days dragged on, each one a repetition of the last. I woke up in a cold, sterile cell, the walls pressing in from all sides, and for a moment, I would forget where I was. I would forget that I had killed Michael, that Raul was gone, that my life had unraveled into a tangle of regret and violence. But then the reality would hit me again, and the weight of it would crush me all over. I spent most of my time reflecting, trying to make sense of everything that had led me here. The anger, the fear, the confusion that had built up over years of suffocating under Michael's indifference. There were times I could still hear his voice in my head, the way he used to dismiss me with a simple look, a scoff, or that cold silence. I could still feel the years of emotional neglect pressing in on me, a constant reminder that I had never been truly seen by him, never truly loved. But then there was Raul, his face, his warmth, the way he had been the only person who really understood me in that place of isolation. And now he was gone, taken from me in an instant by Michael's fury. It still hurt, like a fresh wound that would never heal. Raul had been more than family to me. He had been my friend, my confidant, the only person who had truly shared the weight of my heart. And then Michael had taken him away, and with his death, I lost the one person who had given me comfort in this foreign world. I often thought back to those days when we had spent hours together, talking about our dreams, about everything that had once felt possible. If only we hadn't crossed that line, if only we had been able to keep things just as they were, family. But that was the thing about life, wasn't it? The choices you make, the paths you take, the things you let happen in a moment of weakness, they change everything. And once they change, there's no going back. As I sat in that prison cell, the bitterness of those years with Michael felt like a dark cloud I could never escape. And yet, as much as I hated him for everything he had done, as much as I despised his cruelty and the way he had crushed my spirit over the years, there was a part of me that missed the idea of him. The idea of the life we had built together, however broken it might have been. In a strange way, even after everything, he had been my anchor. He had been a constant, a force I had always been forced to reckon with. Now, that force was gone, and I was left with nothing but the ruins of what had once been. But the biggest weight of all, the one I could never escape, was the knowledge that I had taken a life. I had pulled that trigger, and the sound of it still haunted me in the dead of night. There was no peace, no quiet in my mind. There were moments when I felt like I was drowning in my own guilt. How could I have done that? How could I have taken Raul's life in exchange for Michael's? What kind of woman does that make me? Still, there were days when I found a small measure of peace, when the rage and grief subsided just enough for me to breathe. I tried to focus on the small things. The routine of prison life became a rhythm that was almost comforting in its predictability. The faces of the women in the yard, the sound of the guards' boots on the concrete, the low murmur of voices in the halls, these became my new world. I would find myself talking to the other women, sharing bits and pieces of my story, though I could never bring myself to tell them everything. No one understood what I had gone through. No one could. In those quiet moments, I would let my mind wander back to Winter Falls. It felt like another lifetime now, a world so far removed from the walls that confined me. The town had returned to its usual, quiet rhythm after everything had happened. Life moved on, of course. People went to work, raised their families, lived their lives. But there was a shadow over the place now. Something had changed in the air, something that couldn't be erased. The townspeople would never forget what had happened. Michael's death, Raoul's, my own fall from grace. It had all left a permanent mark on Winter Falls. There was no denying it. No matter how much time passed, the tragedy would be there, lurking just beneath the surface of their everyday lives. It had been a reminder of the power of passion, of betrayal, of hatred. It had shown the dark side of human nature, how a single moment of violence could shatter the lives of so many. I couldn't help but think that Winter Falls would never look at me the same way again. I had been the outsider, the foreigner who had come to their town, married one of their own, and ultimately destroyed a family. The whispers I had once heard about me, about my background, about my being different, had only grown louder in the aftermath of everything. Michael's family had made sure of that. His mother had ensured that I would be branded a villain, the woman who had come from the outside and ruined everything. I wasn't just the woman who had killed her son, I was the woman who had never truly belonged. But then again, I had never felt like I belonged there. Michael's family had always seen me as a stranger. The town had always viewed me as something foreign, something that didn't quite fit. In the end, I suppose it didn't matter whether I had been accepted or not. What mattered was the choices I made, the things I did when I was pushed to my breaking point. And in the end, that was all that anyone would ever remember. As I sat in my cell, staring at the gray walls that seemed to close in around me, I thought about all the things I had lost. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel it, to feel the full weight of my regret. Michael was gone. Raoul was gone. My life was gone. And all that was left was the empty, echoing silence of a prison that would become my only home.